All right. I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for being here. I think I've met nearly everyone in the room, but for anyone who doesn't know, my name is Katie Lawson. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Department of Visual Art for Western. I'm currently in my second year and feel very grateful to have recently curated an exhibition that is on at Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery right now called Erratic Behavior. It's on until April 21st, and this exhibition has also been a way for me to get to know Tahir Karmali, the incredible artist who is here today to share his practice with you all. I will introduce him shortly, but first I want to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Ottawadron, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. And although these are the lands upon which we're meeting today, I think through today's event, we will also be traveling across many lands and would encourage you to think about, for one, the cobalt mines of the Congo, but also the ways that the material which has been extracted at those sites moves through our world and sits in our pockets as well. Tahir Karmali received an MA in digital photography from the School of Visual Arts in New York in 2015. I'll list a few selected solo and group exhibitions as of late, one of them being Water Scarcity, Perpetual Thirst, Wave Hill, New York, 2022, Bound Between Cliffs, a solo show at Circle Art Gallery in 2022, Fictions, also at Circle Art Gallery, and Heimaten at the Museum für Gewerbe Hamburg in 2021. Karmali will also be exhibiting in May at the next Dakar Biennial, which really looking forward to maybe getting some sneak peeks or insights into what you've been developing, perhaps.
It's going to be sustainable.
Yeah. So Tahir will give a talk about this body of work, Strata, which is a part of erratic behavior, but we'll first introduce you to kind of the breadth of his practice and a few different projects. And then following that, I'm going to join him at the front of the room for a little conversation. We'll open it up to the room for questions as well. And so I hope you'll join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure working with Katie on erratic behavior, and it was amazing seeing the show here, and I'm very much looking forward to going through the PDF for sustainable curating. I have already sent it to a bunch of my curator friends, so thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to quickly go through a lot of my practice up until 2019, 2020, and then we're going to sort of like, talk about Strata. So I'm going to try to get through the whole thing. During this part, definitely let your mind wander, look at the images. What I'm saying is relevant, but you don't have to listen to everything. Just look at the pictures. They're nice. So I want to first start off with a project that I began at the Brick Artist Residency in Brooklyn, New York. It's primarily to do with my visa process and identity. I think a lot of things that happen to artists when they move to New York City, especially for me, and especially doing my MA in photography, was a lot to do with identity. Who are you, and why are you here? It's interesting that you didn't come through Ellis Island, whatever. So this is primarily an exploration of my identity. But when I asked my father for information about ourselves, our family, and all this stuff, he sent a lot of documents that were issued by the British government back when Kenya was occupied by the British, and basically these documents that renounced our the Britishness of renounced the British Empire, and then became Kenya, and as we became independent. And so that was all done through a very British sort of bureaucratic system of I'm not part of your empire anymore, which is what happened. And there are photographs of my father and photographs of my grandmother and so on. And so I went through this, and it was really interesting that at the same time I was applying for my OPT, which is optional professional training in New York City as a part of my degree, and then as well as my O1 visa, which is an artist visa at the same time, which is another sort of step of bureaucratic things, right? And I got really interested in this idea of paperwork, land, soil, and how attached we are to the papers that we hold to determine who we are historically. And one of my favorite things is when people tell me what about digital? It's been paper for a while. So a lot of this is made from photocopies of my application documents, acceptance documents, and then the photos themselves are sort of these archival bits and pieces of my grandfather, my father, all kind of held together by the paper-making process, right? Where you can see bits and pieces of mesh, bits and pieces of maps. And then I use a lot of iron. So where I grew up in Nairobi, there's a lot of iron in the soil. But then also this idea of blood as well is something that is associated with iron. And then the not so popular term blood and soil, which is something that is associated with claiming a nationality, or that idea of nationality associated with blood and race and so on. So it's just kind of playing around with these sort of almost fictitious lines, and how we use paper to enforce these borders, and how we use certain materials like soil and iron and blood to be this is our land, this is what it belongs to, and so on. And a lot of it kind of appears as these large sheets of paper with the iron running through it, and these sort of crevices that are sort of symbolic of the landscape and gouges in the earth and so on. Here is a direct reference to one of Eva Hesse's pieces called Contingent. Eva Hesse made this piece called Contingent, which I absolutely love. And then I kind of changed it to My Contingent, which is my life being contingent on these sheets of paper. Further on, kind of playing around with material and getting into textiles. This is where you see my practice kind of moving from here to here into textiles, where I play with sort of charged materials like mosquito netting and my application documents, kind of talking about the idea of an immigrant being a pest or something that needs to be kept out, or the borders being semi-permeable and so on. Now here's where you really kind of start to see the exposing of the paper-making process. So this is where my practice kind of takes a turn from a more direct relationship of this is something that lives on the wall, this is what it is, to a more process-driven presentation of the work, less to do with the end affect of it, but more to do with exposing the process and using the process as a key narrative to drive the story of what I'm trying to say, basically. So here, if you don't know much about papermaking is a filtration process, right? Much like our borders are filtration processes. You can go in, you can go out, you are allowed through this fence, you're not allowed through this fence. And so this is where you kind of see the paper from my immigration application documents kind of stuck onto this kind of fencing, which is again kind of using the insect as well, the pest, the narrative of the pest. This is the wire mesh that you have in front of your screen doors. So this is called paper screening from the paperwork installation that also came with a sound piece of me making the water and the paper kind of coming together. And you kind of have this sort of landscape topographic feel coming through the paperwork. So this is where you sort of start seeing this. This is kind of the presentation of it. This is a whole thing. So this is Strata, which is what we're going to kind of get into, where you kind of see more. I'm going to talk about this in more detail later on, but I'm just going to talk about it in reference to the textile and the appearance of textile in my artwork, and like the marriage of like staining and these processes of like these like kind of holding materials. So the textile here is a holding material for the cobalt and the lithium and the copper as well. So, and the holding material itself having having its own kind of like historic relevance to the piece as well. So these is Strata. These two are actually in the Erratic Behaviors show. This is at Rachel Uffner Gallery, and this is actually the first one of the Strata series that you'll see, which was made at Pioneer Works in 2017 in Brooklyn, which was kind of like revolutionary, where I kind of stripped apart the copper, and I'll talk about it later. Later on, kind of from the cell phones, we start to look at here. This is at the Shed Museum in New York. This is Lotus. So Lotus was made in 2019, and it's in reference to, as you know, like my work is to do with migration and labor, and it's in reference to this the Foxconn buildings in Shenzhen in China. And it is basically outside of the dormitories where a lot of factory workers had committed suicide. So most of those people that worked in those like cell phone factories to make iPhones and so on would often kill themselves, but then they would have most of them were migrants from other parts of China. So it's like an internal like migration. And for the solution is that they decided to put this like prevention netting. So acquiring, now kind of adding to my practice, is a use of vernacular, or this kind of like patchwork vernacular to solve problems, and then turning it into a lotus, which is the reference that I'm making here, is like the lotus as from murky water appears this beautiful flower from the soil to this flower, right? It's much like our phones do come from the soil and go through a process and then appear to us. Like, I don't know if you've ever opened a new iPhone or any box or whatever. It is very floral. You open it up, all these leaves come out, there's paper, and then you have this glistening object, and you're like, wow, this is lovely. And you touch it, and it turns on, and it's bright, and it just looks alien from where it's from, right? So that's Lotus. And it's actually inspired by this poem by Li Xiji, who was a factory worker in China. So it's not necessary. So basically, the inspiration for this particular work came from the poem, so from art to art. So it's Screw Fell to the Ground. If you want to take a moment to read it, basically, I can just read it out right now. It's really short. A screw fell to the ground in this dark night of overtime, plunging vertically, lightly clinking. It won't attract anyone's attention, just like last time on a night like this when someone plunged to the ground, right? So that's kind of the impetus for creating this particular work. Let's move on to short keys. Learn your short keys. It helps. See that? So Strata and Kuba cloth. So this is the series Strata, which is inspired by Kuba cloth. So when I came to New York, I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has this really tiny little African art section, which is kind of combined with the Oceanic Arts section, where they have a beautiful Elanatsui and like all of these kind of very rare African textiles, right? Heritage textiles. So the main one that really attracted my attention were the Kuba cloths. So Kuba cloths come from the Kuba Kingdom in the Congo. As you can see, this is from the archive. coming from 17th century. A lot of them embody and have this very modernist geometric shapes. And it's a point of pride to actually, for a museum to have one of these. They're incredibly rare, especially the original ones. And they're just incredibly gorgeous. And you can see how they appear. Most of them appear behind UV-safe plexiglass. It's really hard to get them. They go in cycles. So they'll take it out for a few months, and then they'll have to put it back. So it can't just sort of like live out and chill with the other work. So they're very coveted. And so here at NCMA, which is in North Carolina Museum of Art, you can see here this kind of cut pile embroidery panel, which is also Kuba cloth. And here as well. So these were primarily used as decorative pieces for the interiors of their homes. And then you can, oh, wait, where is their, here. Okay, so basically what Kuba cloth is made out of is raffia. Raffia is a sustainable textile. It biodegrades, it's wonderful. It comes from a palm leaf product. Once it is woven, it is beaten to the consistency, so that it becomes the consistency as the fibers go apart, comes to the consistency of something that you would think of as linen or cotton or anything like this. And it's a very durable material. And it can hold textile. I mean, it can hold pigments, and the pigment that they use primarily, the Kuba, is tulle, which is also used as a way of like ceremony, and it's a coveted material that embodies like power and a sort of mysticism to it as well. And so because of that, you see it in a lot of like kingdom garments within the kingdom, and you can see it like as both decor and something that is worn for during performance or during sort of like regal affairs, right? And then now restoration hardware. If of late, I don't know if you guys had it here, but this kind of craving for African textiles hit New York like a plague. And restoration hardware, of course, was on the forefront of this to sell to the masses. It was wonderful. Everyone got their Kuba cloth. It's a pillow now. It's great. So as you can see here, wonderfully written by the copywriter of restoration hardware, handcrafted for ceremonial use, Raffia Kuba cloth expresses the art of the culture of the Kuba people of Congo. Employing ancient African techniques, the men hand weave, this is literally from Wikipedia, by the way, like no one really wrote this. And now you can have it as a pillow and a throw, which is great. Now moving on to how Congo got to where it is. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Belgium and King Leopold, but the Congo was King Leopold's like fun little project of tyranny, where he would cut people's hands off if they wouldn't perform well. And this is now kind of, since then, has become the sort of marker in history, recent history of the Congo, associated with slave labor and torture. So there would be like rooms of these hands and so on, and feet and so on. So, and this was primarily for the harvesting of rubber. Moving on to our contemporary context of how the Congo is currently being used by what they call very aptly artisanal mines, as opposed to slave mines. Artisanal is the preferred word of choice for media purposes. These are often mines where children and women and often sort of overlooked by men go down these narrow mines to kind of collect the cobalt that we currently use. And as you can see here, another artisanal mine here. So cobalt is the key ingredient in our cell phone batteries, as well as coltan, which is also, funnily enough, from the Congo. As you can see here, the trade route, so it starts with number 1, where the cobalt comes from, to China for its refinery, and then placed in the phones, and then finally as a tertiary object, so this tertiary phase lands as cell phone batteries and batteries in our cell phones, vapes, Tesla cars, the vapes of cars. So here we have that appearing, and so kind of being in New York City myself, kind of looking at and analyzing labor and thinking about labor and culture and these kind of coveted cloths and like this kind of rise of Kuba cloth started making me think about like what is the combination of the staining of a country's history and so on, and so was born Strata. So Strata is made from the Raffia from the Congo, where I commissioned 2 villages to create the raffia for me to use in, and just like transported it to New York in like the jankiest way possible. It's like, you know, I used to work in film in Nairobi, so I had a lot of friends who are like fixers, so like we could like figure things out. So that was brought over, and then I used American cell phone batteries and American like dead batteries, so you'd have like, you know, Windows surfaces and so on. And then strip them apart to turn into cobalt. And another thing about cobalt, which I kind of find very interesting in terms of art history, is the presence of cobalt as cobalt blue, right? The usage of cobalt as a coveted blue color, which is something that is traditionally incredibly difficult to acquire and make, is blue, and also really hard to do with natural dyes is green. Like the fabled green organic dye is really hard to do. So cobalt would kind of fit in those areas. So cobalt can be mixed with aquamarine and so on to create all these different variants of color. Over here you can see kind of strata appearing kind of into the room, where you can sort of, so this was kind of made while the dye is kind of pushed through and gone down these different layers. Strata obviously referencing the rock strata that, you know, you can sort of like get coal from, or cobalt and so on. And here you can see this one. So this is actually inspired by these 3 children that were interviewed by Sky News. And then like 5 years they were interviewed after, and one of them had passed because of like heavy metal poisoning. I also suffered from heavy metal poisoning doing this. So please don't do this, because I did it, and like don't take my ideas. No, but don't do it because you will get heavy metal poisoning, and that's not fun. But here are these kind of shrouds for 3 children stand and lay in the soil, which is kind of a metaphor for both like being active in the soil and also laying in the soil as your final resting place. So you are constantly in a state of burial. Here as well, Ruanzoris, which is, it's inspired by my first time going to the Congo. I actually went to the Congo through the Ruwenzori Mountains. I climbed the Ruwenzori Mountains with my father, and we walked into the Congo from there, from Uganda into the Congo. Skin into blankets, fingers in the soil, and muddy heart. So a lot of them reference this kind of, and if you look carefully, the black is actually lithium and graphite. The cobalt is actually this green tone that you can sort of see parts of the raffia, which is a bright yellow, and then parts of it are kind of dimmed by the cobalt, and in certain light, it'll get green. And what's great is that this is actually color fast, so it's not, and it's sun fast. So this can actually live in a museological atmosphere without actually like suffering from any light damage. And yeah, this is about heritage textiles, which is Cobalt. I don't think we really need to get into this. I think you can get what the vibe is from restoration hardware. But if you want to know, a lot of heritage textiles don't come from Africa anymore. So we're talking about Kuba cloth, like a lot of the indigo cloths that you get from Mali, mud cloths they're often referred to. They don't actually make them in Africa anymore. If you get one from Africa, like an actual new one from Africa, and you touch the indigo, will come off onto your hands, and that's how you know it's like a real one that's just freshly made. But a majority of them are kind of replicated and made in China, ironically enough, resold in Africa to then be resold to Europe. So technically it is from Africa if you follow the paper trail to a certain point, but essentially, yeah. That's basically how heritage textiles have now been kind of framed. And, you know, restoration hardware, like having these pillows like this for if it was real Kuba cloth, you wouldn't have it out kind of in this sunlit house. Yeah, I don't know where that door is from either. So here you go. Okay, that's it. I hope I entertained you enough. Should I sit here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Turn the lights on. Okay. Now we're awake again, too. All right, we're doing pretty good for time, so I think I will.
Are we doing good for time?
Yeah, we're at 4:30, so
Sick.
we can have a little bit of a chat, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. I think something I forgot to mention in my introduction, too, is it feels really, really special to be doing this. This is the first time that we've gotten to meet in person, so the story of our kind of relationship being that I had reached out as a part of the development of this exhibition, and we've been meeting virtually for the last, I don't know, maybe around 9 months or so. Mm-hmm. But it just felt like work that would have such a resonance, I think, particularly within our university community and with the Center for Sustainable Curating, which is currently having also a focus on materials and materiality. This is the first time that you're showing in Canada as well. It's in Kitchener, which has also been, you know, historically the home of BlackBerry, now of Google. I think there's like a very interesting context in Southern Ontario in which to put your work. So I did want to offer just a little bit more context about that. And maybe as a first question, I'll prompt you to speak a little bit about. This is the first time it's being shown in a public gallery as opposed to a commercial gallery we had kind of discussed, or like this shift from the context in which Strata
I think
is
it's
being
like the
shown.
first time it's been shown. I feel like in not a house. You know what I mean? Like not like a building that isn't supposed to be a house. Well, you like, for example, like Rachel Ifna Gallery, this gallery was a house on the Lower East Side that had been turned in. So this is like the first time Strata has actually been shown in its intended space, which was obviously referencing this sort of museological presentation of Kuba cloth. So it's quite special. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering, actually, in thinking about the place that the historic textiles, as well as your contemporary work, how they circulate through our world, how they end up in collections. I mean, I'm curious if you know anything about these Kuba cloths and their provenance, like ending up at the Metropolitan or in North Carolina, and how widely spread their presence is in the world. You mentioned they're really quite rare.
They're very coveted, yeah. So because they're rare, and also because of their material and the materiality and the skill that is required to like make them, They're very like coveted, and I think we know how they got to the museums. They were like, they were stolen. Surprise! So now they kind of are looked after, and they live in this area. But another thing is that the funny thing about them is that their intention as an art object and a design object is never for them to live forever. They're actually they're supposed to fade away. You can hold them and have them for as long as you want, but they will fade away and disintegrate over time. Mm-hmm. So this kind of activity of preserving them, and this sort of how museums kind of try to sort of squeeze out every freeze time is
stop decay.
Is really interesting, and kind of like funny in a way. It's like in a way kind of it comes from ill-begotten means, but then we're preserving that identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And are they, I mean, in a kind of museum or gallery context, would you see them in a place like Nairobi, or is it really more in Western context that you encounter these in collections?
I'm trying to think if there is anything in Nairobi Museum of it. You'll definitely see it in like Kinshasa and like in the Congo. In Nairobi, it's possible, but you would likely see it in someone's house. Right, like given like Nairobi's history as well, with colonialism, they'd likely see it in someone's house, or what you would see are the replicas that are made in China, or replicas that are even like made in, because like raffia as a material is something that is kind of commonplace in sub-Saharan Africa as both a roofing material and as a housing material as well.
I haven't seen raffia being made before, so I was interested when you were sharing that description with us, and that the word you had used was that it's kind of beaten, like pulped. And so it sounds to me like it's also a very labor-intensive process for folks to make this, right?
Very labor-intensive. I think like when it comes to how it is run and how they're done, it's like a pastime in a way. It's like an art. It's their art practice, right? It's like it's in no way is it. I think like a lot of people think of like African tribes and indigenous tribes from sub-Saharan Africa as like a survival mode, but I mean most of it is kind of spending time doing craft works actually, and making artwork, and adorning things and stuff like that. It's in the Kuba, in the Kuba kingdom, they do really spend quite a lot of time, and it's something that they pride. It's a prideful, they did modernism before anyone did modernism.
It's so true. It's. And is this still actively being made by communities? I mean, you mentioned that there were two particular, perhaps, community groups that produced the raffia that you worked with. Two villages,
Kuba, and they're both the same tribe village, but they still do make them, and still do make the dyes, and it's still like part and parcel of their existence. It's a point of pride.
Of course, and it's also a connection to land, right? And this is a part of land-based knowledge.
I feel like think of it like similar to, in a way, if you think about indigenous cultures here and like Black cultures in America and indigenous cultures in the United States, and specifically also like white women. Think of it as like quilt making.
I liked that quite early in your talk you had referenced this way that like paper enforces certain narratives. And I wonder if you've found that textiles function in the same way. and if there's kind of like an equivalency between those for you.
I think of textiles like kind of closer to, I mean, they're both fibers.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of being called a fiber-based conceptual artist, but that's like way too fancy for me.
No, do it.
But I think of textile as more associated with something that we live with on our body and directly referential to the human body. I also think of it as like primary architecture, as the first thing that we do to like cover ourselves, and then our buildings obviously are secondary architecture. Whereas paper is what allows us to move through secondary architecture, doesn't allow us to move between, doesn't allow, between clothes, yeah. I think you get what I mean.
And I wondered, there was also this word that you brought up in reference to both paper and textile as that which kind of holds. And something we had been chatting about, perhaps even just earlier today, is the way that with this series in particular, the recycled, the dye that is made from the cobalt darkens over time. I wondered if you could talk about how like temporality interacts with these as objects.
I think about so also when it comes to like Kuba cloth, right, itself, like it is something that is preserved by the museums, right, and it's like they're like, and it reminds me of a quote from Eva Hesse, where a lot of her artworks are just crumbling before our eyes, which is so sad, but the photographs are gorgeous. And she said, let the museums deal with that. It wasn't her problem because there's like a certain urgency about it. And like I think that with regards to my work, there is a very they're kind of just like markers in history. It's like, okay, this is about immigration. This is what's going on in terms of my life in terms of immigration right now. This is what's happening right now in terms of cobalt. Like, how long is that? So like,
processes, markers of time.
Does it need to live like forever? Does it actually, have to be? I mean, that would be nice, but they're just kind of like markers of like my life and also the things that I encounter. So the longevity of it could work. I mean, and I think like also you mentioned like the holding material or the carrier material, which is for here the raffia, and then when it comes to paperwork, the actual carrier material is the paper, but the actual narrative is the ink, right? Like what's on the paper is, so they're these kind of carrying materials, but they have their own narrative, the whole story in terms of how they're like created. And actually, I came up this concept from Amelie, who was the curator of the Heimaten at the Museum of Gewerbe and Kunst.
Oh, that name that I stumbled over.
Where we kind of talked about like what are the materials, what materials can say, and how people understand it. Like, for example, you're wearing a silk shirt, which I have the same one, ironically enough, in green. But silk, like, people be like, wow, silk, the immediate, like, and I've used silk a lot as well in my more recent works. People think of it as a luxury item, something that's coveted, something that keeps you warm. It's a protein fiber. It holds color better than any other textile. It's a wonderful material, but and they kind of know that it comes from worms.
Yeah.
But it actually comes from the unraveling of the worm's home, which is like a point of metamorphosis, which is something that I'm really interested in is sort of, especially when it comes to the migrant experience, especially within like like refugee housing and this kind of point where you're in a liminal space where you're supposed to sort of like metamorphosize using paperwork to go from one location to another instead of being held in this temporary space, but at the same time, the concretization of these spaces where in Kenya and quite a lot of places around the world where before the materials, the silk material that would hold and would have these refugee camps would be made from things that could easily be taken down are now being concretized and made out of concrete. So that says a lot about like the silk becoming like the permanent, like how we turn like something that is supposed to be ephemeral and a point for metamorphosis into something that is now permanent for our body. So there's like a lot of like overlaps between that and like how the silk can be a carrier material for like a more problematic dye that I would use. So I'd use like soy milk, soybeans and soy milk to sort of adhere any kind of like mineral. So I've been using like decommissioned police guns that have been like dissolved into basically a powder, and then you mix that with soy milk that you have to make at home, which you can all make your own soy milk at home. And mix that with that, and then you can like actually paint it and bond it with like the silk. So you have like the guns, the unraveling of homes, it says whatever, and then the form of it could be anything you want to sort of play with, right?
I have so many things to say and ask. There are just like all of these threads to kind of pull from everything you just shared. I do kind of want to go back to this reference you made to Eva Hesse, because I know that this is like a North Star artist for you in some ways. And
love her.
Just maybe to hear a little bit about, because you've also shared with me that some of her works were also a source of inspiration for the form that Strata took,
definitely,
the way they hung on the wall,
Yeah, Eva Hesse, I mean, her life as a migrant, then going back to Germany and like reassessing and like going to this like space of where her family was torn apart. Her like ambition to make and battle with all of these like formalists, these minimalist formalists who are really about presence, and be the first artist to work with materials like latex and fiberglass and all of these kind of newer materials at the time is like incredibly inspiring to me, in a way that like I'm really interested in like how newer textiles are made and how all of these things can be kind of played, changed, and in general just sort of like also formally how she would make her drawings and her sketches and her desire to make things perfect and imperfect at the same time. You would look at a cube made by Eva Hesse and like see a body, but it's a cube because of how the treatment just feels so skin-like and fleshy. Where Cube by Donald Judd looks like a MacBook Pro, you know?
Yeah, I love that. I won't be able to look at a Judd the same way.
You need the right lighting for a Judd, yeah.
The right
spotlight,
lighting.
you know, gets the shadows. It's going to be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said something about her work, this kind of like perfect, imperfect paradox that's maybe embodied by her work, we could say.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the way that, you know, you work with abstraction too, and the ways that a lot of your projects have, you know, this sense of a real aesthetic of beauty at first glance. Like, and I seem to remember in writing about your work, there being this suggestion of kind of the beauty being a bit disarming, and then there being this shift to engaging with the work at a deeper level and like accessing all of these different, literal threads that the work pulls at, these histories, the contemporary conditions of life, not just in the Congo, but globally connected with migration, labor, industry. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, like this disarmament.
I think like in part it's intentional and a lot of it is like unintentional. I think that the materials that I choose to use kind of fall in that way. But it's also the nature of my hand is to like make something that I think would look like, and to know that it's something that has to be a presentation. So somebody has to sort of like encounter it and like learn more about it. I think also what's interesting about artworks that are maybe not beautiful is like the draw to learn more about it. I kind of love the idea that artworks that are beautiful, sometimes people don't bother looking at the label.
Absolutely. All the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's how celebrities get away with everything. It's their beauty. But, I like this idea where you kind of like, you have a choice, which is like our life in general. You have a choice to know. And that's what I like to use the beauty for, is like you can look at something and be like, that's beautiful. I love the greens, the coppers are really nice. Will hang really well in my home.
In the Hamptons.
In the Hamptons. Not the Hamptons. I mean, like maybe somewhere a little bit more fun, like the, Santa Fe, maybe with like the
Ooh, desert. Vibe.
Like a wonderfully rammed earth wall. When that looks so nice against a
really
rammed
beautiful.
earth wall. But like this choice of I want to look at something. And I don't have to understand what it is or how it is made. I can just look at it and enjoy it and leave, which is everyone's choice. Like you can switch off. We have the entitlement to switch off knowing about our tragic histories. And that's actually how we get through the day. Every day, everyone has to do it. Like it'll be like incredibly traumatic to like walk through this globe, or just like living in New York City, knowing that there's like a place close to where I live where there are all these like dead bodies that the mob had like buried, so to say, and it's like I see it every day, but like it's weird to sort of like walk by it, but to remember that every time, or to like have to. There are things that we have to, and like I also live in a place where the soil is like we had like the largest oil spill. So we can't actually grow anything from the ground because that would be poisonous. But we have like we have a garden where we can only grow flowers, which are really beautiful. So there's like this distraction of like, oh, we can look at these flowers and it's so beautiful, but we don't have to really engage in why it's flowers and not tomatoes, but and why they're dead bodies or not. Yeah.
Well, I do want to talk about this like toxicity thing, about like literal toxicity, and you described suffering from heavy metal poisoning. And I think what really interested me when I first encountered your work as well is I feel like there is this kind of surge of interest in different dyeing processes, but it tends to be from a place of really still looking to like socially constructed nature as an ideal, and it's like here are all these beautiful naturally occurring plant dyes that we can use, whereas you're really intentionally, again, that thing of choice, like choosing to take discarded handheld technology that has no further use in this world, break it down, and at a cost to your personal health, work with these kinds of materials. I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit further about that.
So the question is, why not flowers? Why battery?
Oh, well, it's not, why not flowers? Why battery? No, it's not even a question. I think like, it's more of a comment maybe that I like that the source of your dye, I feel like really embodies the complexity of being alive right now and of all of the results or impacts of all of these systems that we have put in place, and that often we don't have to be confronted with. Like it's not this kind of like just nice pastoral thing. But do you think there'd be any way of working with this material without the heavy metal poisoning? Like in the right kind of ventilation?
Oh no, there are definitely like ways to do it.
Yeah.
You know, like without like jeopardizing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually remarkably easy, but it's not fun if it isn't dangerous, I guess.
Right. You were more coming to this as like a real experiment.
I did. I mean, I didn't. I initially thought of it as. I remember when I was like working with it, I initially thought of it as just like actually having the battery itself, but that's just no fun. And you know, it's fun to alter the material, to alter a reality, and to show people things in a different way rather than to just show people things like a matter of fact. Just turn on the news. I mean, like, I guess the news. But I think of the battery and using like these sort of like weighted dyes and the textile as, you know, the body itself, our human body, our use of it, and our proximity to it, and how we're holding it, and it's all on us all the time. And then what happens when these sort of layers start to perforate and kind of mix in with each other. Whereas like floral textiles, floral dyes, onion skins, all this kind of stuff are really beautiful, but like you're only interacting with these materials seldomly. I don't know how often you interact with onion skin. It's not really like something that we chill with on our body or ourselves.
Or like carry around in our pockets.
Yes, but we carry guns around,
day.
you know? Yeah, people carry guns around. Like, police carry guns around. Well,
yeah.
In America, in the United States, they do. You know. And so this is like just something that, you know.
Well, when we think of this technology or like weapons, as not coming from nature, but they do. There's just all of these processes of transformation and mediation along the way. I'll maybe suggest one more prompt before opening it to questions, but I was wondering if you did want to share a little bit about what you're working on for Dakar, because I feel like it, and this may be me projecting, but there's something happening where you are shifting from, or rather throughout your work, I noticed there is this constant shift between the lives of individuals and the stories that they have to tell in terms of the relationships to these industries. But then there is also kind of like this scale of more like infrastructure. And so like moving from the personal cell phone to like the cell phone tower, let's say. And I think for...
It's a really great segue to what's, yes.
That's what I was hoping. Yeah, so I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what you're working on right now.
So the Dakar Biennale biennial, it's French, Biennale. The theme is the wake, and it's inspired by Glissant and Khalil Gibran, and just sort of both the idea of wake is in the state of awakeness, wokeness, like the right media just loves to throw around. And also the wake is in the acknowledgement of a dead body as well, or like, you know, the wake of in the sea, and like the wake of someone's life, right? And so I'm making a processional way that is made from antennae, and it's kind of about, in my head, about the Tower of Babel, where everything kind of collapses because of the languages that that is bestowed on everyone, which is actually kind of nice. But this idea of like trying to get as close to God as possible, and I think it's so interesting, like the antennae that we use for television, and just how what we receive from there is like also a corruptible, like the idea of information to corrupt, language to corrupt, and in areas. And so, but also the antennae also look like carcasses to me, like laying down, if you think of like the ribs. So I'm going to use that as sort of these, as a processional way that goes across all these pillars. And then from there's like a textile that I will use, which is sort of like a muslin, like sort of like kind of a bandage-looking thing, sort of like a wound, or like something remnants of wound, and also a shirting material that you would use for like corporate shirting, right? More specifically, like the arms, like the sleeves, as a kind of a peplum-like vibe. So to kind of like create these sort of like bleeding carcasses of like, you know, hands that are dipped in blood. But it's just like, imagine like if you were wearing a white shirt in Wall Street, and you were like, you know, that Hamlet scene where you're like washing your hands off the blood.
Spot.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that. It's a lot of layers of like communication, manipulation, and greed and blood and you know, guns.
Yeah, technology, language. That was something else I had noted.
Yeah.
Like I think this invocation of like heritage textiles when they're not, or like artisanal mines, is like such. It shouldn't be shocking, but it kind of is how warped that language is. In how it kind of weaves this different narrative around these incredibly violent systems of capital gain.
Oh, I mean, like if you like reframe it, like you can make a phone sound wonderful.
Yeah.
Like from artisanal mines, the cobalt is hand-picked only for you, shipped across the Indian Ocean, you know, and refined in the best, you know. You can really like just use like the words that they want you to use, and then like all of a sudden it's like you're buying an iPhone in a farmer's market.
I love it. I think I'll turn it over to questions in the room, and I can come around with this guy. It's not amplifying in the room, but it is for our recording. So just bear with me while I stroll around. Yes.
Sounds like so. Hi, Tahir. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your wonderful presentations and
Thank you.
questions, and your conversation was really great. And I had questions. Actually, I had many questions because I really liked your research areas. And then, but actually, Katie, she covered most of my questions. So anyway, it's. But I have more. So I have another questions, more formal questions. By the way, I'm Kyun, and I'm from graduate student. Just formal questions about when you make decisions for arranging your pieces. Like there's some particular materiality on your textile sculptures, right?
Yeah.
And then I saw some website of your works, and then some of them is very static to, like, looks like a painting. So some of them is very square kind of thing, and then some of them is more naturally kind of hung on the wall, and some of them is actually coming from the ceiling. So but basically those materials pretty identical, similar. I don't know the in details, but so when you actually make decisions, when you actually install your pieces, and do you have any? Just my curiosity, how you actually operate and how you actually make decisions to why this one is hang on the wall from the ceiling, and why this one is very computational to see the work.
Yeah, I think of it very closely to like dressing yourself, like dressing your body, because a lot of it is textile, dressing the building, dressing the wall, like how you can dress asymmetrically like I am right now, or I can put the sleeve on and then be symmetrical, and just kind of thinking of each of them as a personality, and as kind of like clothing, and like who are they? I really do think of them as not me, as more like themselves. I know it sounds super corny, but they are kind of like, for me, when I start making it, it is sort of like a way that they lead themselves to what they want to become.
Or is it, I wonder, like, have you decided whether it's going to be a kind of more volumetric form as opposed to like a flat wall hanging prior to dyeing them? Or is it after dyeing and kind of seeing like what emerges with what is held by the raffia?
I'm trying to like backtrack here and think. Well, obviously, like I have my references, like which is like the Kuba cloth, the body, the drapery, the this and that. Then also like the vernacular of like the lotus flower, or what a sheet of paper is supposed to look like, and so on. But for the most part, it is a like an emotional kind of feeling that I have of where I think things should be right. And I would say that it's closely linked to like an emotional feeling of when you choose your clothes in the morning. It's like kind of the same thing, like where you wake up in the morning. I don't know if this is everyone, but it is definitely me, where I'll be like, I have this shirt that I want to wear and I will make it work somehow. And you just go through your entire, I have a lot of clothes. And you just go through the whole thing. And so it is that kind of emotional like state. And like if you know me really well, or if you know me for a long time, like I dress, I go through periods of dressing, and the same way that I go through periods of like making as well. So like right now I am techno club Tahir. I might be like country western Tahir like a month from now. Techno club.
Techno club. What was the?
Tahir, my name.
Tahir. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah, Kirsty. Not to put you on the spot, but I'd love for you to share the anecdote of the Eva Hesse work that was in Plastic Heart, or like your interest in that.
I was going to ask an Eva Hesse.
Oh, perfect.
So thank you. It was like, I've loved these works for a long time, and it was amazing to hear the kind of context around them. And I do have an Eva Hesse question, because I totally see the relationship. And I also think that Eva Hesse's work, as it kind of is brought into museums and changes colors, has come to look more and more like your work.
Yeah.
And I also, what fascinates me about her work is actually how it refuses museum conditions, like when they want to show it in the way that it was originally made, they have to remake it. Like you can't do a backwards process on her work. But okay, so the thing that's like fascinating me right now is maybe a relationship in collections between works that could decompose and works that disaggregate and then proliferate. So as soon as there's plastics in something, they're not going to decompose. They're not going to go back to the earth. They're going to break down and proliferate and then escape.
Yeah.
And so, like, your work seems to kind of be on this edge of that. And
Exactly.
just because Katie brought up some of these issues, and I'm somewhat obsessed with them right now, I just could we talk a little more about like the future of your work, like what's going to happen to it, what happens to cobalt, what happens to aluminum. The raffia, I imagine, will go back to Earth.
Yeah.
Sort of the 10,000-year life of your work.
Wow, that's great. I love that question, and I think about it a lot. I think that so what is interesting is that for the raffia to take on the color, the plant itself has to open up. So it needs like fabric. So it's not like painted on top. It actually has to like the stoma has to open, and then when it dries, it'll contract and like pull everything together. So for the dye to leave the raffia, it'll actually have to be like intensely like washed out with hot water. So the cobalt will live with the raffia and then will kind of degrade, and the cobalt will just will just be turn into soil basically with cobalt in it. The copper will then oxidize and turn into copper oxide. Statue of Liberty wise, that vibe. And then also kind of like sit on top. There is a glue in there, which is a fabric glue made from. So there's also plastic that is attached and adhered to the aluminum as well. So that will proliferate. So essentially, most of it will oxidize and disintegrate and turn into soil, but essentially because it's actually not cobalt, it's cobalt oxide now, so it's already been, it's really cool when it turns into cobalt oxide. It goes, like it burns. And then that's pretty much what will happen to it. It'll just be a very like cobalty, coppery kind of soil, and I don't think that it would be particularly good for the soil that it finally rests in. Yeah, but it would be ideally sandwiched between gypsum, concrete, and a bunch of other things. So we'll see if that helps.
I think my comment fits nicely into the more coherent question that Kirsty posed, but the question of the like transformation of this specific encounter of materialities I'm kind of interested in, and I realized I was a bit obsessed with the battery question, probably because on my way coming here from Vancouver I had lithium batteries in my bag and I wasn't supposed to, and I was very worried about setting the whole plane on fire. I didn't. But then also the battery question, I think, in the way that you were saying, oh, we wear batteries so close to our bodies, and what does it all in here and kind of like hold, aren't we all kind of batteries for, better or for worse? But then your choice to open up the battery and kind of like break open and make space and stuff like that made me also think about the battery as a storage unit or a repository. And I think we're close to this archive question, which then goes back to what you were asking about in terms of like, where does your work store itself, or which parts of it will be legible maybe 10,000 years from now or not? And I think I'm just curious to ask you a bit more about how you relate to memory in your work then, in terms of like, what do you bring to the fore, what do you choose to overwrite or synthesize with contemporary materials that weren't part of the original Cuba cloth era or something like that? So
So obviously, like with regard, well, your last question, I'm going to ask it first. Like the holding material is just the raffia it goes, and this idea of dyeing raffia is a Kuba cloth like making process, veering away from the modernist sort of expression that they actually had. So I didn't want to appropriate how they create their textiles, and instead sort of apply my own artistry to it. Kind of also using the copper as a reference to its past modernist like history, as a modernist style history, as a visual thing as it breaks apart as well. In terms of the batteries and the longevity of these pieces, and like where I envision them being, I think I've always kind of thought of these works as like a commentary on our current sort of desire for preservation in museums and sort of thing, and this is my idea was for these to sort of like live next to and rotate with other Kuba cloth textiles. Like it'd be lovely if they could live in a museum and also rotate with them. But with the imminent destruction of our society in this Anthropocene, hopefully museums could survive, I don't know. I often think that them, like as you said, like the markers and talking about history, I think that a lot about art making and being an artist and like your life and what's going on personally is a way to use that to deal with things that are deeply personal, and a way of like kind of expression is sort of like how these things kind of like come into being. And there's as much research and everything that I can sort of put behind making something. But you're just seeing like fragments of myself, I guess. And I guess at some point my body will extinguish. And is there really a need for these after I'm gone? I don't know. It's like it's the age-old question of like, how long does an artwork need to live for? I guess.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Phenomenal work. I'm a bit nervous asking a question because I'm quite taken with the work. I've got a bit of a two-pronged question. One that relates to the very early work you showed that was wall-based and that made reference in some terms to painting. And you talked about the work being shown in a museum context, which has been well documented throughout history as being a space of contemplation, which perhaps is a replacement for ecclesiastical spaces or religious spaces. And it got me thinking about the forced trade in the colonies of the Catholic faith, Christian faith pushed upon these non-Western, non-religiousized communities. And so I've got a question about your relationship to painting, contemporary painting, mainly because these are textile works which are a vehicle for raw minerals, pigments, which is essentially also a backbone of painting. And also, as we went into this later work, I found it hard to disassociate images like this from a crucifixion, like the negation of a crucifixion.
Oh, yeah.
And the triptych, too, which is obviously drawn from, religious iconography. So it was something you very latterly talked about, this figure of a god. And so I wondered whether religion played a part at all in your thinking, and also if you see these as contemporary paintings. We've talked about them very much as sculpture up to now, but they've got a massive relationship for me with contemporary painting and expanded painting practices. And to follow on from Kuhn's question, where they move away from the wall into the physical space, the way they're draped, that for me was a massive shift. And I wondered whether that was also a big question for you when they no longer interact with the wall and they're free, standing, free floating.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like back to sort of dressing and the architecture. Like painting does kind of like is like the what's that Frank Lloyd Wright quote? The breadth of space in painting and something. It's a really good quote, and I swear it makes sense here. I just cannot figure it out right now. But I think of the wall work specifically as things that like purposely for the wall, for the building, and thinking of drapery and curtains and carpets that you'd put on the wall or something like that, but also definitely in relation to painting, because they are essentially painted objects, dyeing, kind of like a watercolor-esque kind of thing. I have painted in the past, but the wall has always been kind of a really attractive space for me to sort of like interrupt or play with the architecture itself is often what I'm going for. So either making a textile like too long for just one wall to hold so that it has to touch the ground, or like to so it's more like related to the building or to the wall itself. Or to the space itself, and especially like bringing around like restoration hardware, again, kind of thinking about like how we decorate our spaces is also really important to me. In reference to religion, I grew up, well, my mother is Catholic and I'm baptized Catholic, but then my mother converted to Sunni Islam, my father is Shia Muslim, and like there's like religion has always been like something that like I've always like kind of like cherry picked different stories from different religions. Like I'll take something from Islam, I'll take something from Catholicism, or I'll take something from Christianity, take something from Buddhism, or like all these kind of it's kind of just because I grew up in Nairobi where there was like a religion buffet. There was a lot going on. And like I had friends who were Hindu and Jain and Catholic and Christian and Jewish and so on, and listening to all of these different stories as a child, like these things kind of like these sort of like anecdotes stay in your head. Yes, there is definitely like there's definitely like something kind of like weirdly iconoclastic about certain things I'm doing, but then also oddly Christian and Catholic, especially with the presence of the body and the fact that I talk about the body a lot, and like the staining and the eating of it and the consumption of it and the degradation of it, and then also it coming back to life, and then like it's super Jesus, but then also it's like this abstraction, this modernism as well, in this sort of like soup of capitalism that we have right now. Painting, this is like kind of like the first time that anyone has really kind of spoken to me about painting, because a lot of people kind of slot me into sort of like the fiber arts and crafts section. So it's really nice to be put into the halls of like the great painting lexicon, and I'm actually at a gasp of like how to respond to being put into this category. Thank you. That's all.
Well, as you said too, it's like when we look at art history, cobalt plays such an important part.
Yes,
and we think about
painting.
like where all of these pigments come from, the way we value them, how they're that value is transformed or intensified through the reification of this like work of fine art. So I think, it's an interesting relationship to think about.
Yeah, and I guess like also painting as a trend is like it's like one of those things where it's like it's constantly in resurrection, like
Also constantly dying and being
constantly
reborn.
dying. it's like there's always like an artsy article or like some commercial article where it's like painting is back, which also I watch I don't watch. I like sometimes what's thrust upon me is HGTV. Which I find fascinating. And my next show in New York is actually about like real estate and like drawing and all of this stuff. And the presence of like framing and brass and like how things are framed and what's desirable for a framed space, for a wall work, and like thinking about like consumer accessible artworks as well is a big part of it. And then prints of paintings are really desirable, and I find that really fascinating, you know, especially when you see the AI made or the kind of CGI made homes of like condos that are being sold in New York, and like the choice of furniture is interesting, but the choice of paintings is fun. And I saw one where it's like you could have just put like you could have put the Monet in this fictitious thing. It didn't have to be the poster of the Monet from the Met. Like, it was very strange. And so it's just this kind of like, you know, like, it's funny. Like, but yeah, I'm really fascinated with like how people are adorning spaces, and like of late brass, because brass is also similar to painting in a way that it is constantly desirable and undesirable as like hardware materials. I don't know if anyone watches HGTV, but brass goes through a lot where it's like brass fixtures are like, we love brass fixtures, and then they're like, no, stainless steel, and then brass, and then stainless steel, and like it's all to do with resale value, and so brass is just always thrown back and forward, and I just find that very, very funny. Yeah.
I think we maybe have time for one last question, if there is one in the room.
I can ask a quick question.
Yeah, for sure.
So I keep seeing Raffia come up in sustainability discussions, and I have to say I'm a little suspicious, not of the sustainability of Raffia, but of how that would be coming to North America. So I guess the question is Raffia like one thing that has to come from the palm trees in the Congo, or is Raffia like a grass-based or plant-based material?
Yeah, it should come from palm. So you can technically make raffia from palm trees, I guess. The one that's specifically in the Congo is what's indigenous there. But any kind of palm-based thing would be referred to as raffia. Like you can go to Madagascar and they would have like a different breed of palm tree and still kind of be turned into... And is the palm tree a grass?
Oh, I've just seen like grass raffia materials as well, but they're probably just using the word.
Yeah. So yeah, raffia is that. And raffia is... it's a great material because, and it's incredibly strong as well. So it's great for sacks. It's great for lots of things. It's great for holding, like, you know, a lot of stuff, and quite rough and sturdy. Obviously not as strong as silk, but like pretty strong, and not as strong as cotton. But it's there. But again, like, with any kind of like thing around sustainability and being like, yes, raffia is next, that's the next material, it's going to have to go through the plantation process, which is going to destroy the environment anyway. So it's tricky. Like any new material that has to be introduced into a plantation, which means that, you know, slavery again, predatory visa and labor activity would happen. So
yeah, predatory, I think that's such a good term for it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, and I think too we'll be wary now, like, you know, if raffia makes a splash in Canada, it's like, well, but trees from where? How has it traveled to get here? Who's making it? All of these questions. And I think it's like comes back to this question that, sure, there are a lot of more sustainable options in textiles and material, but you ramp any of those up to the scale that our current stage of capitalism requires, it's not going to be sustainable anymore. Like it's, yeah, I'm very wary of this too, kind of like materials coming our way.
And I mean, you have to remember that canvas is cotton, right? Like canvas is, you know, and bringing it back to painting a little bit, and then we sort of use gesso and or like, you know, if you're like printing an image like from a printer onto canvas, that's like a cotton material, then plastic is kind of put on top of it, then these kind of like dyes and inks that are going on top of it. But the base thing is like, oh, but it's cotton, but you know, it's all bad. Yeah. But I love canvas though.
Me too.
I love it.
I also love Raffia. Tahir, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to host you.